Listeners, and welcome to the second season of the Adapt podcast, the podcast about how society adapts to the world's growing challenges. My name is Naresh Margesan, and I am a present freshman at the Ohio State University, majoring in computer science and engineering. Now, today, viewers, I'm actually very excited to record this very special day and special episode for everyone watching at home. In fact, today is a rare Adapt podcast special episode where we will take a slight detour from innovations and explore an innovative field of expertise for one single episode each season. Now, today I'm accompanied by my dear friend Ryan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Sivakumar. I'm a sophomore here at OSU studying neuroscience, and I'm also on the pre-law track.
And Ryan is here to help us go through the very unique and nuanced field that neuroscience and law has been in recent years. Now, the subject being the cross between, of course, neuroscience and law is deemed together as Neuro-Law. We'll go into the specifics of this field later, but let's first meet our guest of honor today to tell us more about this field and more of the specifics. Now, today I have the honor to be joined by Mr. Joe Wszalek. Mr. Wszalek is a prominent leader in the field of neuroscience and law. After getting a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Neurobiology, Mr. Wszalek has gone on to complete a combined JD PhD in neuroscience and in policy. He then went on to get more experience in law as a legal resource attorney at Wingroad's Clinic and assistant faculty associate at the University of Wisconsin School of Law. Now, Mr. Wszalek is a founder and director of the Center for Neuro-Law and Equity, a place for progressive scholarship and consulting, and most importantly, the idea we're here for today, which is Neuro-Law. So thank you again, Mr. Wszalek, for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure, gentlemen. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, and to begin with, one of the most common questions I like asking a lot of our guests throughout, both season 2 and season 1 is firstly, what are the steps to get you to the place you are at today? And essentially, what is your story to bring you to Neuro-Law?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk a little bit about my professional background. Like you said, I came out of a background in biology and neurosciences. When I was an undergrad, I studied biology and neurosciences, pretty molecular kind of bench level work. But in between undergrad and my graduate training, I did some kind of program building and some social work with kids in the community. And that really got me interested in the intersection between neuroscience and society as a whole, kind of applied neuroscience. And then I just kind of happened to stumble upon this dual degree JD PhD program in neuroscience and public policy. And the rest is kind of history.
If you could tell us, what really brought your interest to neuroscience and, the intersection, just personal from personal viewpoint?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to talk about that too. So I've always kind of just been personally interested in neuroscience, particularly more kind of cognitive and behavioral neurosciences. Just found that a really fascinating aspect of scientific study, in part because it explores how humans are and how we interact with each other and with the world. And of course, the legal system is, you could say, just a giant social experiment in how we interact with each other and interact with the world around us. So I think the development of kind of this Neuro-Law field, which integrates neuroscientific studies and kind of legal questions or legal concerns, is kind of a natural place for this field of neuroscience to land as it applies to society and as it applies to more social questions around law and philosophy and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually had a remarkably similar process into getting interested into Neuro-Law. So, yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah. So going back to Neuro-Law as a total idea, you put the idea of Neuro-Law into simple terms and really kind of give us your full but simplified conclusion of neuroscience and law so far.
Yeah, I'll give you the elevator pitch for Neuro-Law. Yeah, I mean, really, Neuro-Law is just the study of the intersection of neuroscience and the law, or the study of topics that kind of touch upon both neuroscience and law. To be honest, I think Neuro-Law is more of a umbrella term for kind of a subject matter or like a field of studies than a dedicated field itself. Because Neuro-Law covers a lot of what I would call more conventional fields like bioethics or biotechnology, or in my case, just kind of hard neuroscience, regular neuroscience, if you want to call it that. So it might help the listeners or anybody interested in Neuro-Law to think of Neuro-Law not as like a specific track or a specific program, but really more this umbrella designation of kind of all concepts or questions that could fall in the intersection of neuroscience and the law.
Got it. That makes, I think, a lot of sense. And hopefully we can get more people, focusing on, professionally as Neuro-Law and really going down for what now is a decently niche path for most students. So we hope that grows in the future.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. I think we'll go ahead.
Okay. Could you explain essentially what happens at the Center for Equity, just for the viewers at home?
Yeah, well, I created the Center for Neuro-Law Equity, which is kind of my just personal project for neuro-law research and advocacy and client work, really just to kind of house all the individual or disparate pieces I've been working on throughout my professional career. So even starting as a graduate student, I've been working with some clients and some interested people who'd had concerns in the law that kind of arose from neuroscientific issues. So, injuries or things like that. And that's one of the areas of work I've incorporated kind of more formally into the Center for Neuro-Law and Equity. So helping clients or individuals navigate steps of the legal process where it might touch upon issues related to, injuries they've acquired, or, conditions that they're living with, trying to incorporate some of the things I know about neuroscience and behavior into kind of legal advocacy or legal representation. The next major component I work on is more advocacy based. Increasingly, I and some of my colleagues have been working on issues related to like youth justice, so justice for kids, particularly kids who might have neurodisabilities, brain injuries, kind of neurocognitive developmental disorders, like autism spectrum disorder, things like that. So we've been working on some projects trying to, create outreach and to create materials and resources that legal actors or policymakers might be able to look at in terms of improving the experience that these kids have when they have to interact with the legal system. And kind of third and finally, the other thing I spend my day working on is just research. I am a trained neuroscientist researcher. That's what my PhD is in. And my research, which focuses on the intersection of brain injury and cognition, really explores some of these like social legal phenomenon. And I'm interested in exploring how people kind of mentally interact with things like legal language and legal ideas. So that's kind of what I do over here at the Center for Neuro-Law and Equity. And I've really made a pretty conscious effort since very early in my training to really try to integrate and synthesize neuroscience and the law as best I could. And the sort of advocacy and research I do is the result of that process.
Mm-hmm. I was curious about, you mentioned about how we interact cognitively and behaviorally with the words of the law. Could you maybe go into a bit more detail about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk more about that. So, as you guys might know, one of the kind of most notorious characteristics of the law is its language. Legalese is kind of very stereotypically archaic and abstract and difficult to understand. And that's kind of always been the way that it is. But starting over the past few decades or so, researchers, including cognitive researchers like myself, have been interested in trying to figure out from a scientific perspective what that legal language means to the people who have to understand it. So I did a series of experiments starting when I was a graduate student, just trying to understand how people with brain injuries interact with legal language and how they kind of reason through scenarios or fact patterns, if you want to call it that, that are based on legal language. So I don't want to get too much into the results of that just
Right.
for the nature of this podcast, but kind of exploring the cognitive mechanisms, things like memory, processing speed that might be associated with those tasks of legal language comprehension, and that we might be able to use to predict performance outcomes on tasks of legal language. So basically just trying to get a clearer understanding of what happens in your head when you have to, sit in a courtroom and listen to a judge give you a bunch of legal language, for example, and then maybe try to use that to make the language easier to understand or reduce some of the cognitive hurdles that people have to jump over when they go through a legal process.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'd want to interject on one of the few words you said earlier. Specifically the processing speed and memory really brought an interesting, I think, point of view to what you were talking about earlier. Because a lot of the you know previous episodes on that podcast, and for my own field in computer science engineering, I think it shows truly the complexity of the human brain. And I think that's something that neuroscience
Mm-hmm.
really dives very deep into. That I think maybe the viewers at home or the common, average other, students here at OSU don't truly realize the complexity of the human brain. So just a little interjection of, appreciation for how complex the brain is and the study of neuroscience.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, people have been debating like the nature of the human mind and the human brain for a really long time. But at the end of the day, it's a giant organic electrical conductor, right? Like it literally works by sending electrical signals through itself. So in that regard, it very much functions as information processing machines. You want to call it a computer, you can call it whatever you want. And again, people have been debating this for a long time, but we are, as humans, kind of stuck with what evolution gave us, and that just happens to be our organic, electrical transmitting organ that is the brain.
Yeah, it makes me, I think, appreciate, people like Ryan, yourself, for studying such a complex field as, someone who just personally can do that. Move to Ryan now.
Yeah. Since you're well versed in both neuroscience and law in your JD, PhD, education and all that, which side of the coin, I guess, do you think helped you better in this Neuro-Law journey? Because at least with my experience, each topic I have to look at it with a different intensity between neuroscience or law. That balance really changes from topic to topic. But I want to see your perspective and which one do you think is most influential in your analyses in your Center for Neuro-Law and Equity?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And to be honest,
Mhm.
I get that question a lot from people who are interested in the work I do or the trajectory I came out of. But like I said earlier, I tried really hard to synthesize or fully integrate my science training and my legal training as best I could.
Mhm.
So even though I came out of this dual degree program, it's hard for me to answer the question which half was more important because I kind of experienced them simultaneously and I tried to integrate them as best I could. And now that being said, in terms of where like my heart and interests lie is definitely more on the neuroscience side.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of strengths and benefits to kind of emphasizing the neuroscientific aspect of Neuro-Law. One of the major ones being that it is obviously much easier to interact with the kind of empirical and technical aspect of neuroscience and neuroscientific data if you have like a technical background and a formal training in neuroscience. It's not necessary, of course, but as someone like me who has always been interested in the kind of scientific process and the kind of communal and iterative aspect of science as a like collective development in an academic field, the neuroscience side of the 2 degrees is kind of where I felt more comfortable and where I felt more at home.
Right. Okay. Um, as far as I understand, the intersections between neuroscience and law, there's been three mainly or well documented intersections. One is the capability of its assessment. So basically, it can assess individuals' mental states, which can impact determinations, competency, guilt, and sentencing. Two, intervention. This domain considers brain-based treatments and behavioral interventions for rehabilitation or risk reduction in criminal justice. And three, revision, where neuroscience insights may encourage revisions in legal doctrines by challenging assumptions about free will, responsibility, and punishment. Neuroscience can reveal the biological and psychological factors influencing behavior, which may change how we assign responsibility in criminal law. Now, my question for you is, are there any other points of contact between neuroscience or law or neuroscience and ethics slash philosophy in general that that I didn't mention or haven't been as well documented?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys really landed on some of the major topics that the field has been focused on for the past decade or so. And as just kind of a brief aside, I'll say one of the reasons that I think those are the main topics is because they are just the kind of natural intersection points between neuroscience and the law. And I hate to use the phrase low hanging fruit, but they're definitely kind of some of the most obvious questions that come up when you start to think about what neuroscience could offer from the law, understanding if somebody really committed a crime or what does it mean to be guilty, questions like that. Those are definitely where you guys are landing with those 3 main points. But I can talk about a kind of another intersection point or another intercept that aligns a little more closely with my work. And that is more a point of, I guess, what you would call diversion. So the legal questions you guys just talked about, they tend to happen relatively late in, say, a criminal proceeding. So if you're talking about questions of like guilt or competence, that means that a person's already been arrested for a crime. They've already been arraigned before a judge, something like this.
Right.
But increasingly, people in like the public policy field or in advocacy fields for persons with neurodisabilities or limitations are trying to focus on earlier stages of the legal proceedings. So trying to keep people out of the system in the first place, that's where this term like diversion comes in. So instead of putting people into the criminal legal system, maybe putting them into, for example, a specialized juvenile court that is better able to accommodate kids, is better able to implement like science or evidence-based practices into the way that it interacts with kids, that sort of thing. A lot of the work that I do, like for example, that study on legal language, kind of expressly points towards a system where we can divert as many people out of the legal system, particularly the criminal legal system, as possible, and focus on kind of some of these upstream antecedents of behavior. So if somebody has a communication problem, for example, if they end up being, pulled over by a cop in their car, for example, they might have a harder time talking with the cop, answering questions. They might get themselves into more trouble than they would have if they hadn't had a communication limitation. So I and other people doing work like I do are kind of trying to expand the scope of the legal map, I guess, if you want to call it that, and kind of focus on some of these areas that aren't part of like the traditional criminal trial and that kind of imagine a world in which people are shuttered into other pathways or put on other trajectories that aren't just the kind of traditional criminal legal pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard for interjecting early. It brought me to the idea of kind of cultural differences and how so many different demographics really, affect how neuroscience and law works. So yeah.
Um, I mean, back to that point where that you were just mentioning about how you're thinking about the potential of Neuro-Law in changing how court cases are actually run in this country. What do you think Neuro-Law's potential is in reordering the status quo, not in just in terms of the court process, but maybe in other aspects of society as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, that's the $1 million question in terms of where the field is headed and what it kind of imagines its horizons to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the really fascinating dynamics between the law and neuroscience is that the law kind of comes out of its own historical trajectory, and it has its own like logics and rationale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and neuroscience has kind of its corresponding epistemologies and logics, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think one of the benefits of that scientific experience is that, it's following this kind of like trajectory of conducting more experiments, collecting more data, kind of furthering our understanding. And as neuroscience, quote unquote, advances, right, as we just continue iterating the scientific process, I think the gap between neuroscience's understanding of like humanity and the world around us and the law's same understanding of humanity and the world around us, I think that gap between the two is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mm.
And what that means for us is trying to figure out how do we either merge the two closer together, so like bring the law into better alignment with what we understand from a neuroscientific perspective about what it means to, be a human and interact socially with each other. Or recognize that maybe we need to build new systems come from scratch, sort of like abandon the historical trajectories of the law and its honestly outdated frameworks for things like
Mhm.
competency and that sort of thing. So
Right.
that is kind of a more abstract and philosophical answer to your question. More practically, I think what's going to happen, at least over kind of like the short to near term, is a growing increase in the sort of scientific information and data that gets offered to a court. So this is a big topic of the research, and people who have like studied the use of neuroscience in courtrooms have found that it just kind of keeps going kind of like exponentially up. And so I think, regardless of what the law wants to do in terms of how it approaches neuroscience and its own kind of like logics and arrangements, more and more judges are going to see more and more neuroscience evidence in front of them in a court, and they're going to have to figure out what that means to how they run a trial or how they interact with parties and things like that. And particularly from somebody who works with people who have brain injury, there's a lot of potential in the law to introduce evidence to explain how brain injury might affect the way that a person, acts towards other people or communicates or is able to navigate aspects of life like, employment or schooling. Those are all really relevant topics to most kind of legal disputes or legal interactions. And I think neuroscience has a lot to offer a more kind of conventional legal framing to how those disputes or questions get solved.
Mm-hmm. I guess with the recent news and just the constant development of technology in the past decade or so, with the boom of AI, the news about Neuralink and VR, all that.
Of augmented supports.
Exactly. And it got me thinking, since Harish is a computer science engineering, I think it would be and I'm neuroscience, it'd be worthwhile to ask how do you predict the law will react if slash when brain computer interfaces like Neuralink or uh things similar to that become widely accessible?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I'll add a caveat right to start that this is not my area of expertise, obviously, but I do know that the field of Neuro-Law and like neuroethics and bioethics have been really interested in BCI's brain-computer interfaces for
Mhm.
ever since I've been in the field. And I know that there are a couple questions that are kind of still unresolved or that are still driving a lot of the at least the academic interest. And those basically boil down to who gets this technology and what can they do with it. So there's a distinction between tools of like what are called neuromonitoring. So machines that could kind of read or analyze your brain. So think like brain scans or things like that. And then there are tools of, I think they're called neuromodulation. So tools that could actually affect the way that your brain works. So if you guys are familiar with like deep brain stimulation, the implants can put in your brain to drive stimulation, that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Mhm.
So I know the field makes a distinction between those two types of technology. And I think they raise different levels of kind of like ethical and legal concern based on what they do. And then another question, and this is kind of more from a policy side, is like I said, who gets these technologies and what do they get used for? It's one thing if they're made freely available to everybody who might have an injury or um, had been born with some sort of condition that affected their neurological function, that sort of thing. But if they're used, recreationally by only the very wealthy people to improve their whatever job performance or that sort of thing, that could create
Mhm.
social implications that are beyond the scope of like therapeutic or a rehabilitative use. So I know these are the sorts of questions and debates that kind of branch within neuro-law and neuroethics has been looking at. And I think it's a really interesting question. And if I could solve it, I would definitely be a wealthier man than I am right now. I can tell you that.
I mean, it's the idea of the brain computer interfaces and stuff has almost been in a way a sort of fantasized sort of idea that we've grown up being around with so many different movies, music, etc., books, going over human affected or technology affected human minds, which it's odd to see that companies like Neuralink
No.
and more of that actually affecting our brain. So I would also like to extend a very tiny little question just out of my curiosity. Um, Not dealing especially with neuroscience, but going towards the law, we're seeing a lot of robots, androids, and artificial intelligence all kind of merging together to create a lot of different products. So, what would be the kind of, if just you could give us in a small tidbit, kind of the legal matters dealing with these types of issues?
Legal matters at the intersection of like AI and neuroscience and the law.
Yeah, pretty much, and just androids, and lots of different.
Oh yeah. Oh boy. We could have had 3 more calls about that topic, to be honest. I mean, there are
That's asthma.
all kinds of questions and concern. I mean, so I think when you start at more of like a theoretical or conceptual level, people are asking questions like, what does it mean to be human? Do do advanced artificial processing machines count as human, right? Will we get those futures they predict where we're just trillions of digital machines in a computer? Like, what does that mean to be a human? Those sorts of things. Um,
Yeah.
Kind of closer to the practical side, more kind of mundane issues related to things like, copyright and infringement, what does it mean to be an artist whose, work is either incorporated into some of these large learning models, or who decides to, generate work through these large models? What does that mean in terms of like the rights and ownership? I think one question that interests me more than some of those is, what are kind of like the policy implications of the way in which these technologies are used in terms of their effects on, like, workers? What does it mean to somebody whose position is outsourced and replaced by these technologies, like a personal assistant, or somebody whose role is replaced by one of these LLMs that can, like, generate notes and emails and that sort of thing? What does it mean in terms of the legal aspect of, human rights and human dignity to be able to do meaningful work and things like that? I think that's another really interesting aspect of those conversations. Again, these are all like the billion-dollar questions, and whoever can resolve them will have a lot more professional and financial, like, success than I will. But those are definitely the sorts of questions that people in the field are struggling with right now, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, personally, me and Ryan like having a lot of those type of conversations. Like how does this gonna end out? It's all for the future. And sadly,
I will interject one more thing, guys, at this point, because we've been talking about technology a little bit. One of the like concerns within the Neuro-Law field, and this has been the case for some time, is this phenomenon that we call like neurohype. And people are very concerned about the way in which some of the technologies aren't necessarily integrated or talked about in a way that, like, truly captures what the technology can actually do.
Right.
And I know personally, coming from neuroscience, this was one of the big concerns of neuroimaging technology back in the day, even more so now, but definitely at the start of Neuro-Law about 20 years ago. As like fMRI technologies and other imaging technologies of the brain gained in popularity and became more powerful, actors in the law or policy, looked at that technology and said, wow, this might have a lot of implications in terms of like rights and policy and things like that. And that is absolutely the case. But I want to emphasize, coming from that scientific side myself, there are real practical limitations to what some of these technologies can do, in terms of like the things they're able to study, the type of data they're able to produce, the types of analyses you're able to do with them, the like robustness or the integrity of the analysis processes. These are all like critical concerns within these analysis pipelines on the neuroscientific side, but often those limitations or distinctions kind of get collapsed when we talk about them from a legal or a policy side. So I definitely just want to make that caveat. These technologies can do a lot of cool things, and they definitely show a lot of promise, but that sort of like hype nature, that kind of scientific fantasy nature of them is really appealing, and I know people in the field have pushed back against that. The reality that we encounter, a sort of like Minority Report type future, which was definitely one of the sort of things I remember being bandied about 10 years ago, where, the say maybe cops are like wearing portable fMRI machines that can like scan your brain and determine if you're going to commit a crime or something. Like, that might be possible, but that is just so far beyond the scope of the technology, and it's so far beyond the meaningful pipelines through which those technologies like generate and create data, that it really kind of is speculative. So I think it's good for all of us to keep in mind, as we talk about the intersections of neuroscience and the law, that some of these applications and some of these technologies might end up having like radically different trajectories than we think they might do now, for better or for worse.
Yeah, and coincidentally, you kind of just answered our last question that usually we ask a lot of the guests, which was kind of like the next frontier has, AI, augmented reality. So I think it's just one neuro hype and I know where that goes. So, sadly, we're coming to an end into the last minute this Adapt special. So I want to thank Mr. Wazalik for joining us here today on this Neuro episode special.
Yeah, my pleasure. Like I said, gentlemen, happy to have appeared on your show. I'm really glad that both of you are interested in the intersection of neuroscience and the law or technology. And if there's anything else I can do to help, just feel free to reach out.
Mr. Wazalik for being on the show today. And final thank you to my best friend Ryan for coming on the show today and helping co-host this first Adapt Season 2 special. So I hope you guys all enjoy it and put your comments down below. And if you want Ryan to return, thank you again, Ryan, for coming on the show.
Of course. Like, share, and subscribe. Post on your stories. Like the reels. Do it, all that. I'm doing too much. Sign off.
I know, yeah. Enjoy this Adapt Season 2 special.